Welcome to Summer School, Club Fantasy's best ball podcast, streaming exclusively on YouTube. I am your host, Austin Amandolia. And before I introduce our co-host tonight, just a reminder to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications so you know every time we go live. But now to introduce my co-host, the one and only Matt Record. Matt, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Another day in paradise. Excited to talk about a really fun topic in tournaments today.
Yeah, we're getting into tournament contests today, and we'll talk more about it in a second. Guesting tonight, we have Benny Israel back with us. We had some technical difficulties we worked through last week, so we just brought Benny right back, and we're talking about Benny's specialty tonight. Benny, how are you?
I'm good. Hopefully my internet's better. Made some changes to the little studio behind me, but excited to be here. And I guess I'll plug myself in case things go wrong again. But you can follow me on at Benny Bestball on Twitter for some bad takes and bad internet. So
Yeah, and I think for anyone who doesn't follow Benny currently, I think you've talked about just your feed is basically like you being a best ball player and drafting and talking about what you learn and how different things go. So yeah, just talk a little bit about what kind of content you do on Twitter.
So, I really like looking retrospectively at my own best ball lineups and trying to apply like what the current trend is, whether it's week 17 correlation, just going back, learning from my mistakes. And I make a lot of mistakes, so hopefully you guys can learn something too along the way with me. So that's really the goal of my page.
I love it. And that's the thing with best ball that's so great is there's always so much to learn and things change over time depending on what strategies people are taking. So we're going to get into all of that tonight. This is our third episode. Tonight we are focusing strictly on tournament contest. I'll overview tournament contests in a second just for anyone who's new. But if you want to dive deep into just best ball 101 and into contest selection strategy, deciding which contest you should even be entering, I encourage you go check out our last two episodes where we dig in deep on all of those topics. But tonight we're going to discuss the 6 things that you need to know when drafting a tournament contest. And when we talk about tournaments, most of the time we are talking about best ball contest where you draft a team and you play that team weeks 1 through 14. And then the top 1 to 3, sometimes 6 in some of these wild tournaments, but the top few players, they advance to the next round. And then you compete against another group of people somewhere. It ranges depending on the contest, could be between 10 and 18 people. You compete against them in week 15. The top couple advance. You do the same thing in week 16. And then in week 17, that's your finale. And that's where all the money really sits. That's where you get these big winnings where you can win $3 million if you're playing Best Ball Mania on Underdog, which is just a bonkers amount of money to imagine winning in any sort of sports betting contest, at least for me. I know some people they're like, oh yeah, that's small money, but for me, I'm like, I can't even imagine. But we're going to talk about those 6 things that you need to know when drafting in these tournaments. Just a reminder to send in questions. If you drop them in the chat or the comments, we'll get to them in future episodes. So we're going to jump right into it. Our first key thing you need to know when drafting in tournaments is that you need to be stacking. And this is kind of an extension of Best Ball 101. This has become a kind of Best Ball basic. That's like the number one piece of advice most people will give you when doing Best Ball for the first time. So first off, let's just talk about what is stacking and why should you do it. Benny, let's start with you. Benny, you're on mute.
There we go. So stacking is when you correlate your lineups with players of the same team in hopes of spike weeks. So normally it's with a quarterback and a wide receiver counterpart. And really the goal in best ball is to get those spike weeks. So correlation is key. Really try to stack your quarterbacks with receivers and vice versa. Because it will give you spike weeks. And not only that, but it makes it easier to kind of bet on one instance of things happening. So a quarterback throwing to a receiver that you have stacked will get you double points, whereas your quarterback throwing a touchdown, then having to rely on a whole other team to have a receiver score a touchdown, way lower odds. It just helps you out by making your lineup decisions easier, honestly.
Yeah, Matt, anything you would add to that?
No, that's pretty much it. You're kind of banking on the players that you have like Benny said, on the same team. It's much easier to have those big influxes of points when you have the QB throwing to the tight end or the QB throwing to the wide receiver, anything there. It just makes it more likely that the already unlikely thing is for you winning in some of these things, which we'll get to in a second. It makes it more likely fewer things can go wrong.
Yeah, I really like that. And I like Benny and Matt, you both framed it in a very specific way that I appreciate. You both said it's picking players from the same team. And I think thinking of it that broadly is really helpful because it's really easy to get stuck into like, okay, I drafted this receiver, so I have to draft that quarterback, or I drafted that quarterback, and so I have to draft this receiver. And that doesn't always work out. Sometimes other players are not stacking. And so they're just going to take whoever and they're going to take your quarterback. They're going to take Joe Burrow after you took Jamar Chase. And it's like, what the heck? That was supposed to be my quarterback, but they don't care. They're just trying to mess around and they may not be taking this level of strategy. And so you might think, oh, well, now what do I do? Do I just say forget it and go to a different team? No, you still stack players from the same team, right? If Jamar Chase is having a big game, there's a good chance that Joe Mixon also has a good game, right? You get a long touchdown or a long throw to the 5-yard line to Jamar Chase, and then Joe Mixon punches it in after that for a touchdown. Like that's how these big offenses work, right? Everybody's winning. And so you're really just narrowing your options to teams that are going to have optimal outcomes. So I want to stick on stacking for just a little bit. Like, how are you stacking whenever you stack in teams? And so I want to talk about this a couple of ways. There's like stacking running backs, stacking quarterbacks, tight ends, receivers, but there's also the order in which you pick your players. Like, are you trying to get your quarterback right away and then stack later, or with some receivers? Are you doing it the opposite? Like, what are your strategies when you're trying to pick out your stacks throughout the draft? Benny, let's start with you.
So really, I kind of let the draft fall to me. Especially this year, the number one receivers that you're taking in like the first and second round, those quarterbacks are really pushed up this year. So you don't really have an option. Like if you want to get Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce stack, you almost have to use your first 2 picks on them. So I typically will, if I'm taking those players, I will sprinkle in like Hurts if I take an AJ Brown, but I'm not gonna. I do enough entries where I don't do that every time. So I'm more along the set of I will get my wide receivers in place first, take a good look at my team, and then kind of base my quarterback decisions off of that later. So I'm typically getting my skill players first.
Yeah, and we call that a backdoor stack where you take your receiver first. Like let's say you take Cooper Kupp. You don't need to take Matt Stafford till like what, the 12th round. Like he's way down in ADP right now. And so getting him later on, that's getting your backdoor stack. And that's one way to do this where you're still giving that high ceiling for your teams without using your first 2 picks on a receiver or running back and a quarterback. Matt, what about you? When you're stacking, like how are you thinking about it as you draft?
Yeah, for me, it's actually very similar to what Benny's doing. I really like the not just deep stacks, like the deep stacks or deeper stacks, however many E's you want to throw in there. Like, for example, Kenny Pickett, it doesn't take nearly anything to get Kenny Pickett, right? Like he had a fine enough rookie year, right? We're expecting a jump, but we have no idea what to expect. But people aren't expecting a whole lot, right? You can get George Pickens very similarly for not much, based on the low expectations for Kenny Pickett, right? You can get him for pretty cheap. So it's like at the end of your draft, when people are trying to fill in their rosters, trying to figure stuff out, you can find these pairings, which if they go off any given week, it's going to be good. And it takes pert near nothing to get them. Because to your point, Austin, the people that we want to stack are the ones that are the hardest to stack. You're talking the Mahomes and Kelce. You're trying to, obviously I'm blanking on other examples right now, like Jalen Hurts, AJ Browns, those types of people. Like maybe Dak and CeeDee Lamb is more possible, but again, you have to invest quite a bit up front to get them versus these ones that you can get in the last, I don't know, let's say the last third of your draft, right? Really not a whole lot of investment, but the upside is totally there. Sure, it's a gamble, right? Because people that make it that long, people don't feel that positive about. But I really like trying to find those very niche stacks. And now for my IDP little plug, I love grabbing people on defensive lines from the same team that no one's really drafting because, they also produce well too. So
Nice. I love it. So, kind of building on this idea of stacking, we're going to get into our second point, our second key to drafting in tournament contest. And it's that you need to correlate your team to optimize for week 17. So, like we talked about in these contests where you have these advancement structures, so that in week 17, you're playing with anywhere between 100 and nearly 500 other players, you need to optimize your lineup so that in that final week's contest, you have the highest ceiling outcome available. So I kind of have already explained a little bit of why we should be correlating week 17 games, but I want to talk just a little bit more about it. So Matt, is there anything you would add on to that of like, why should we be targeting these week 17 games?
yeah, so in order to win these tournaments, I mean, first you have to make it to week 17, right? Like that's a
Yeah.
give. That's a gimme. Like you have to get there. But if you are glorious enough to end up making it to week 17, it's a blank slate. You need to beat every other team that has made it into the finals. So, what better way to do that than picking players from the same team that have an optimal matchup for any given reason, which we're about to go into, in that week where you need them to do the best that they can possibly do.
Yeah, exactly. Benny, you got anything else on that?
I just find it super interesting with week 17, how you're really building for that game. It's kind of an extension of like the DFS principles, how you would build your lineups there, which makes it really interesting because that has a much larger like sample size of success than any best ball site will ever have up to this point because it's been around probably 10 years longer. So that success really should open your eyes to maybe that's something you should do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when you're playing in these tournaments, you think of them as best ball contests for the beginning, but eventually it ends up you just have to win multiple DFS contests to advance. It's basically like weekly winners at that point, right? That the new contest style put out by Underdog. So when we're talking about attacking week 17 games, and let me just make this a little bit concrete. So we'll talk more about our favorite week 17 games in a moment. But one example is like Miami plays Baltimore in week 17. And so if I draft Tyreek Hill with my first pick in a best ball draft, I'm probably going to find ways to sprinkle in other Miami players and other Baltimore players into that lineup because I'm betting on Tyreek Hill to be an elite receiver. And if Miami is putting up points to be able to support him being an elite receiver, then in week 17, Baltimore is also going to have to put up points to be able to keep up. And so it's just this idea that when we get to week 17, those offenses are going to pop off and they're going to give me the ceiling outcome I need to really win a lot of money in these contests. So when we're doing this, are y'all targeting multiple week 17 games? Are you focusing on just one? Like, how are you balancing the number of week 17 games that you're looking for on this? Benny, let's start with you on this one.
Typically, I never really like to reach for specific players, like to get something like that. But on average, I would say I get about 2 or more in my lineups any given draft that I do. Whether it's just a one-off or I'm really stacking like the lines in Detroit and have 3 lines and 2 Detroit players or something like that. But it really just let it fall to you, and if it makes sense, it might as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like what we're talking about doing this stacking and correlating, but reaching too far just to make it happen and to kind of force it can also be detrimental to your lineup, which we'll get into in just a moment. Matt, what about you? When you're looking at kind of week 17 correlation, are you looking to target multiple games?
Yeah, I try to, but that's just me being trying to diversify my assets, right? Like which may or may not be good, but I think if you can keep it to 1 to 2 games, that's a good spot because you diversify more than that, then you're not really doing it. You're not really diving into the stacking, right? Versus if you go with the 1 or 2, or kind of like Austin, what you said, where even you diversifying it within people in the same game, right? So like we'll talk about, I mean, yeah, the Dolphins and Ravens, like getting people from that game, there's at least a little more spread, better chance that if not everything's going to fall apart completely. But yeah, I try to keep it to 1 or 2.
Yeah, I think one way to think about it too is like you have, imagine you're playing a DFS contest that has like a 2 or 3 entry maximum. You're not going to do the same lineup for both of those entries if you're maxing out the entries, right? You're gonna target kind of one matchup for one and say, okay, this is gonna have this optimal outcome, and then for the other entry, you might say, okay, I'm gonna pick a different game to target and see its optimal outcome. And because you're getting to draft 18 players or 20 on DraftKings in these best ball drafts, you're kind of getting to do that where you can target 2 to 3 of these week 17 games and really just hope that maybe they all hit or at least one of them hits, or if the one you wanted to hit didn't hit, you have a backup plan. But I think what Matt said is really good advice. Like don't go and say I'm targeting 5 games in week 17, because at that point it's just like, okay, you're not getting the correlation, right? You're spreading yourself too thin. It's unlikely that all 5 teams are gonna, or all 5 games are gonna hit that sailing outcome. So, and even if they do, you're then tapping into other bills that other people have, and you're getting less unique. So it's nice to just like take a stance, pick 2 or 3 depending on the draft you're in and how it falls, and go with that. So now I want to talk a little bit about what are y'all's favorite week 17 games to target for this season, because I love talking about this and I'm very excited about this year's games. But I wanted to get y'all's takes too. What are your favorite week 17 games to stack this year? Matt, let's start with you.
Yeah, going first, I get the privilege of taking what I think is the gimme 101 pick in the Bengals Chiefs. Like those are teams that you're already going after those players, right? It's harder to stack them, obviously, but 2 great offenses, 2 great teams. By the time week 17 is happening, there's a chance they're playing for playoff seeding, so you expect them to be playing all their players. So I absolutely love that game. For more of the sleeper game that I sneakily like, it's the Rams against the Giants of all teams. It's noted that the Rams don't really have much of a defense, or at least not unknown names on defense. The Giants, there's not, other than Saquon Barkley, there's not a whole lot of players on there that are going to cost you a whole lot to get. And we expect the Giants to still be playing for maybe wild card spot, depending on how the Eagles and Cowboys do. Probably not the division, but they're going to be playing their players. They have to run up the points. The Rams have nothing of a defense. They'll probably be already playing their rookies and second years to figure out what they have there. So I really like the Giants to do a whole lot in that game. So not so much on the Rams side, but definitely the Giants.
Yeah, I love both of those. I mean, there's, like you said, the obvious Chiefs Bengals. Everybody's going to want to go after that one. I have the Giants Rams matchup as a top 5 pick in my week 17 guide, because I think that's such a unique one. I don't think people are going to be going for it, and there's so many directions you can go with it. Benny, let's come to you. What are your favorite week 17 games to stack this year?
I think you guys read my notes, but no, I have written down next to my computer. I'll take the Rams Giants one a step further. So they both actually played the Saints in the playoff shootout as well.
Nice.
So I call it the Rams Saints Giants triangle. If you look at my exposure on Ball Mania right now, it's a lot of those players, because I really don't have faith in any of their defenses. And I mean, I'm a Rams fan and I think they're going to get shredded, but that might like really lead to some fantasy points being scored. And one other interesting one that sounds disgusting is Tennessee and Houston, but again, their defenses might not be very good. They're pretty Tennessee seems pretty consolidated right now in who their playmakers are going to be. And the Houston players are basically free. And again, they play twice in the fantasy shootout. So,
yeah, this was one that I found very interesting when I was writing my article on all of this, because they ended up being my worst ranked matchup purely because of the downside of them, right? There's a huge amount of risk to this. Like it could just go completely sideways. But like you said, Benny, nobody's going to stack this team. Nobody's going to stack this game. They're not going to want to do this. Yeah, it's going to be Benny, and he's going to win $1 million because Derrick Henry's going to put 40 points up on Houston, and then they're going to just have to throw the ball to Dameon Pierce 12 times and to whoever else. I don't even know, Robert Woods in that offense. Like,
yeah, that's the dream I have playing in my head, at least. So we'll go with it.
But it's one of these things where you kind of have to say, like, okay, if I take a stance on this lineup, like I just know there's a million ways it could go wrong, but I'm going to tell myself a story of how it can go right. And I'm going to feel comfortable losing on that contest if it goes wrong. Thankfully, neither of you took my favorite two for this one. And what's funny about this is I, in my week 17 article, I ranked them. And so you think I just picked the one that you ranked the highest, but there's something about like in my gut. I'm just like, no, it's like I can't get past the Dallas Detroit matchup.
That was going to be my honorable mention. Yeah.
I love this matchup, and partially because if you are at the 10 or 11 spot in a draft, you can start off with CD Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown. And coming out of the first 2 rounds with those 2 receivers, I'm just like, yes, let's do it. I don't care. I'm good. And there's so many interesting ways to stack this team because you can get Jared Goff and Dak Prescott late. You've got Sam Laporta as the tight end for Detroit, and there's not really any other tight end competition. I don't typically like rookie tight ends, but this is like the one time I'm like, I might be okay with it here because of just the situation around it. And then there's so many cheap receivers out of this because everybody thinks, oh, it's just going to be Amon-Ra and CD Lamb, and there's going to be no other pass catchers in these offenses. And that's just not true. Like there's so many other receivers to target. Michael Gallup coming a second year back from injury. Brandon Cooks, like I kind of like him as a late round pick for a resurgence this year. So that's another one I like. And then my honorable mention is the Baltimore Miami one because starting a draft with Tyreek Hill, Mark Andrews, and Lamar Jackson, it feels good. You can't feel bad about that until it goes all wrong. But right now I can see the MVP season coming from Lamar Jackson and Tyreek Hill actually hitting those 2,000 yards and being offensive player of the year. So, we'll see. We'll let it ride. I've already done it more than once. Which is great. Great. So we're going to move to our third point in drafting and tournaments. So this third point is don't get cute because wasted roster spots will kill you. And so this is all just about poor roster management. And we talked a little bit about this in our past couple of episodes. We've given some examples of it. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some examples of poor roster management that we think can really mess up your team. Because remember, when you're playing best ball, it's really easy to waste roster spots. If you pick a player and they don't put up a single point for you all year, that was a wasted roster spot, right? And there are many different ways you can get yourself into that situation. And we're going to give out some examples. So, Benny, we're going to start with you. What is your favorite example of poor roster management?
In tournaments specifically, people tend to look at advance rates from like last year and think, oh, that's the key to getting in there. I noticed a lot last year. There were a lot of 4 tight end builds that actually worked out, like advancing into the shootouts and Best Ball Mania, especially. But there's like no way you're going to have the upside to be able to take down the tournament. So anything that really is going to cap your upside, like you got to be selective with it. You don't want to just take high upside players the whole time or else you're going to score some zeros. But anything like that would cap your upside, and something like kind of bully quarterback would go along with that. Like if you take Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes, you kind of got to take your stance there. Who's going to score more points and pick him? Because they're not going to add too many more. The counterpart, that is. So.
Yeah, I love that. And that's going to get into my favorite one here in a moment. But Matt, let's come to you. What is one of your favorite examples of poor roster management?
Ooh, I hope I don't steal yours. For me, some strategy in redraft that I like doing in redraft just does not translate to the tournament game. It's handcuffing, right? So when you draft a stud running back, you have to be drafting in these tournaments like everything you're doing is going to work, because things won't work, obviously, and that's where people's teams downfall. But you have to draft assuming all the things that you're doing work. So in the past, just previous examples, if you drafted Dalvin Cook in redraft, often towards the end, you draft Alexander Madison. So when Cook invariably gets hurt, you have someone that you can plug right in right there. If you're drafting in a tournament and you're expecting Cook to be healthy the entire time, right? That Alexander Madison pick is going to do absolutely nothing for you the entire year. Like, sure, maybe it'll work out where he does fill in, does do something for you, but you're not going to get to week 17 with one of those precious bench spots giving you absolutely no upside and never actually being a starter for you to get to week 17. So again, bad example because that's obviously in the past, but I don't love doing the just straight handcuff things. Like, sure, stack wide receivers from the same team. Like, some people are going to have big weeks and others won't. There's a chance that other lower seeded wide receiver will actually be worth something during the year. But like the true, like the primo running backs and their straight up handcuff guy, leave that for someone else.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. And it's one of those things too where if you're handcuffing in best ball, you really should just be handcuffing somebody else because you're trying to find ways to gain advantages on your opponents, right? You want to beat them. You don't want to beat yourself, right? Like this isn't a safety valve where you can say, okay, well, I ended up not needing my handcuffs, so I'll just drop him and pick up somebody else. Like that's what we do in redraft. That's what we do in dynasty. If that makes sense at the time, which now that I think about it, probably never makes sense, but whatever. But in best ball, you can't do that. And so, like Matt's saying, you could just end up having a solid 0 all year. And if your elite player that you drafted in the 3rd round goes down that you had the handcuff for, like that's going to kill your team as well. Like drafting a player in the 3rd round and then failing and dudding, like that's something that's going to be detrimental to your team as well. So I'm with you, Matt. Don't handcuff. Maybe if you're taking those late round dart throws, like focus on other people's handcuffs. Don't do it out of spite though. Focus on yourself, right? Like this is actually I'm gonna give myself 2 roster management things. Don't ruin other people's drafts. You're messing with yourself. People will get in these drafts and they'll be like, oh, somebody just took Travis Kelce. I'm gonna take Patrick Mahomes. Why? You're not getting the Travis Kelce, Patrick Mahomes stack. That was the point of doing that. And why are you just saying, I'm going to take this player to ruin this person's stack? Oh, that person got Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. So I'm going to go Joe Burrow. What receiver are you stacking him with? You're ruining your upside. And the other person is just going to be like, okay, I've got 2 elite receivers that are going to be correlated. Cool. And then I'll just correlate with with Patrick Mahomes because we'll have that week 17 upside. There you go. Done and done. The one I actually wanted to talk about was the bully tight end strategy. I thought I was so clever doing this last year. And now in hindsight, I'm like, oh, Austin, what was wrong with you? Because you think if you pick Travis Kelce with your first pick and then come Mark Andrews, you're like, oh, one of them will be in the flex. Doesn't always work out that way. Turns out, particularly when Travis Kelce is 100 points better than the next best tight end over the course of the season. Don't do bully tight end in tournaments. There are certain styles of best ball where your bully tight end makes sense to box out your opponents. We will talk about those next week, not in tournaments though. And just as a real life comparison, if you were to try bully tight end this year with Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews, let's just talk about the fact that Mark Andrews is probably going to have a 0 on your squad most of the time. And that 0 could be replaced by, based on ADP on Underdog right now, the likes of Josh Allen, DK Metcalf, Brees Hall, Josh Jacobs, and Calvin Ridley, right? So by taking Mark Andrews, you're taking a dud most of the week. And instead, you could have been taking these, Josh Allen, who could very well be the QB1 once again this year, and 3 other players that are going to probably be top 12 at their position for a player who's going to sit on your bench most of the year. So don't do the bully tight end. It ends up being a waste. It's not as effective as you think it is. And also it's really hard to stack and it's probably not going to work out. So now we're going to move into our 4th one. So our 4th key takeaway for tournament drafts is get different, but don't just get different for the sake of getting different. And so here we're talking about kind of like large tournaments. In large tournaments, you need to get a little unique to dominate in week 17. Like in Best Ball Mania, you probably need to do a little bit something different to have that ultimate ceiling outcome that gives you the unique lineup in week 17. But don't just draft players way ahead of ADP just for the sake of getting different. So I want to talk about like who are some of your favorite players to get different with, and also just tell us a little bit more about how you approach building unique lineups whenever you're doing best ball. So Matt, let's come to you first, and let's actually just start with how do you think about building unique lineups and tournament drafts?
Yeah, so to your point, the same sleepers that you have on your team that got you all the way to the promised land week 17, our odds are good. The other people who are in that finale in the tournament with you have those same people, right? So you kind of lose that edge and like, haha, took this player and no one expected to do good. Yeah, so the other teams. Now you have to differentiate your teams from them. So when it comes to that, I find sort of once I draft, I'll just say my starting lineup plus, the next 3 or 4 picks, main dudes. I'm going, I mean, as you should be for best ball anyway, straight upside, people that I think other people aren't going to be nearly as high on or have the opportunity to be in that spot. So I think of it less as, again, it's such a shift from redraft strategy, right? Like it's such a shift where like I need to pick someone who could in week 17 or any week just absolutely go off, but I don't have to worry about not starting them that week, right? Like I just need to have them on my team so that when they do, I'll be good.
Yeah, I love this. Benny, what do you have to add to this? Like, how are you thinking about getting unique in your builds?
I'm kind of excited because I might trigger both of you based on point 3 here. So some ways that are like pretty clever to get different. Don't steal stacks, but I had written down here, instead of going like Kelsey Mahomes, if you would get like a Chase Higgins and Mahomes falls to the 3rd round, that way you're correlating for week 17. So you're using another principle at least. And there's not going to be too many people that are actively targeting that. I can't really imagine. And another one is I'm never handcuffing a running back. That's not what I'm trying to do. But in more ambiguous backfields where you're not spending so much, sprinkle it in. It's not like an every draft type of thing, but you can see a world where week 15 the Commanders have to run the ball 20 times with Brian Robinson, and then the next week they're in catch-up mode and have to throw 10 times to Antonio Gibson, where they can both help you in those specific weeks. But outside of those 2 things, I just want to bring them up because they went against what you guys were saying. Players that aren't 100% rostered to sprinkle in at the end. That's where the final 2 rounds, I'm not really. If someone really drops drastically from their ADP, I'm probably going to take them. But players like Josh Reynolds, Joshua Kelly, and even like Marquise Goodwin, he's a walking spike week. And now he's on the Browns, and they don't get drafted every time. So that could be an advantage in its own.
Yeah, I love what you said. I'm going to come back to the point about like not necessarily handcuffing them, but like getting multiple running backs in these ambiguous backfields. Because what I want to say is like we're giving out general rules, but there's always exceptions, and there are always situations where you can give yourself a reason to do something different. So like I think a good example for the running back situation is don't take AJ Dillon as a handcuff to take Aaron Jones. Take both of them because you're making the stance that the Green Bay Packers are going to be running the ball a ton. And so they're going to both have weeks where they pop, right? That's a way to get different and to intentionally be like, I'm saying that both of these players give me points throughout the season, not just, oh, I need to have some insurance for if an injury happens to Aaron Jones. I think that's a really good point. Like we need to, whenever you're playing best ball, you need to be in a mindset of like, how is this going to go well? How is this going to work out? So these running backs are both going to have that upside, not how do I protect myself, right? If you start protecting yourself in best ball, you get into this conservative mindset, which serves a lot of people well in dynasty. It serves a lot of people well in redraft. It's good to have backup plans there, but in best ball, you need to try and leave that aside and shoot for the moon and hope to get that outcome, that high outcome.
And just real quick going on that, there is a world where one of them does get hurt then, and then the other player will have that upside to hopefully propel you in those playoff rounds. So it's kind of two alleys to get there.
Yeah, exactly. Not doing it in every draft, but there are times where you can do it. So let's talk a little bit about some of your favorite players to get different with. So Matt, we'll start with you again. What are some of your favorite players to get different with?
Yeah, the people I have aren't necessarily like the things Benny just said, like end of the round things, but I really like Van Jefferson. He's never lived up to what he's been, but he's always a great best ball candidate, and I think he's going to be the wide receiver 2 on that team, who's going to be losing by a lot, and it's going to have to. Well, I'm sorry, Benny. I think they're going to be losing by a lot for a lot.
They might be.
Yeah, I really like him. Other quick hitters here because I know we're limited on time, but like Tyquan Thornton on my Patriots, like again, it's costing a whole lot of nothing, but they drafted him with a pretty high pick. I expect him to be involved. Isaiah Likely, they're the backup tight end, like talking about like not stacking things, but if Mark Andrews goes down, like that's someone who has splashed a little bit in his rookie year last year, and that's someone who if Andrews goes down, will be immediately probably a top 10 tight end because Lamar Jackson likes like going after them. And then the last one there, just a little thing for my IDP folks, Jawan Bentley, linebacker for the Patriots. He signed a big old contract. All he does is get tackles. People like avoiding the Patriots linebacker room, but he produces, and you can get him for nothing.
I love it. Benny, some of your favorite players to attack to get different.
I think my favorite right now is Josh Reynolds. He just always seems to pop up in like the middle of the season when someone gets hurt and then score a 20-point game. And then you don't hear from him for like 4 more weeks. Then he does the same exact thing. From Hard Knocks last year, it looked like the coaches love him. I think they called him the Slim Reaper of Death or something, which is pretty cool. So that's an automatic 10 spots in my rankings. But like I said, Joshua Kelly and Marquise Brown really stand out because I think Joshua Kelly's the clear backup on the Chargers. Austin Eckler is getting a little older. Isn't the biggest, most durable guy. He's had 2 good years now with really good injury luck. But there's an alleyway for him to produce for free. And just going back to Marquise Brown, I'm going to butcher this stat, but I'm going to try anyway, but it's close to 20% of his games. He has like a spike week over 15 points of when he plays. But if you're getting that for free, might as well sprinkle him in. Wide receiver is always volatile.
Yeah, Marquise, good one. That's a good one. I'm going to do just one really quickly. I don't know why it clicked for me today, though. I'm into Marquez Valdez-Scantling because he is like lost in this Kansas City offense in the news, right? People are like Travis Kelce, obviously. I'm not going to disagree with that. Kadarius Toney, maybe hurt again. Rashee Rice, who? Like, I know, I get it. The hype, draft, whatever. That's dynasty hype, clouding our best ball judgment, in my opinion. And then Sky Moore. I love Sky Moore, but he hasn't proven it yet. Marquise Valdez-Scantling was re-signed last year. They kept him, even though they kept him. They didn't keep Juju Smith-Schuster. That's notable to me. And he was a downfield target and had high upside, particularly down the stretch last year. So I think he's a sneaky one and he's not going drafted. He's an interesting one to stack with. Okay, we're going to move through our last couple more quickly. So point number 5 is just check your exposures and adjust accordingly. And this is essentially like you look at your player exposures. You can check this on pretty much every app now that you're playing best ball on and see how much of each player you've taken. And the idea is like you don't want to get too stuck in player takes, at least not by accident, right? You want to make sure that you feel comfortable being highly exposed to certain players. Because like, let's say last year, if you were overweight on the Broncos, you were likely hurting as someone who was overweight on the Broncos. So you have to keep an eye on it and balance it out and make sure that you are adjusting accordingly and make sure you still feel comfortable with taking the players at the rates that you are. So Benny, how are you using exposure rates when you draft?
So I kind of keep it at like a 4x rule, so 4 times the field. I try to keep everyone under like 32%, even on my like, oh, this guy's going to be the best ever type of players. I tried to I diversify quite a bit. And just a quick tip, what helps me personally, because I like to sprinkle the first 3 rounds. I try to get a piece of everybody since I do so many drafts. But I'll actually go on the Underdog app and name my lineup the first 3 picks so I can scroll through it quick. I had my first repeat in Ball Mania at the beach after a couple drinks and was a little disappointed, but diversified elsewhere.
There you go. Matt, what about you? How are you using exposure when you draft?
Yeah, it's all about, again, diversifying your assets, not putting all your eggs in the same basket, however you want to express that. It's important. So it is important. I mean, everything else we talked about, like you have to feel some sort of way about certain teams, right? It's like even the Broncos last year, right? There was a world where the new Russell Wilson signing, they take the world by storm, right? And they win you that. But in the same way that they could win it, the same exact thing could happen where they could just lose it. So I like having multiple tickets with multiple different, primary people so that only one of them needs to work, right? And then you're going to end up winning something instead of going all in on sort of one thing. So I try to check myself during drafts saying, yes, I have a lot of this player because I personally think they're going to do very well. And while that still might be true, there's also a very real world where they don't. So you can't always have the same builds in all of these drafts, especially if you're doing multiple entries to the same tournament. Like, diversify your assets, you have a better chance.
Exactly. I love it. Yeah, it's kind of like you think about it. If you're buying a lottery ticket, you're not going to pick the same 5 numbers every time. That would be dumb. That'd be really dumb. You're going to choose different numbers each time to increase your odds. Coming up, point number 6, and this was one that Benny really brought up over our little group chat. A June best ball draft is much different than an August best ball draft. So this is all about considering what time of year you're drafting, because you can draft all summer. Hell, you could have been drafting in February. I think best Underdog release drafts before the Super Bowl even ended, which I entered because it was fun as hell. I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And I had some money at the time, so I was like, yeah, okay, cool. So that was a very different draft, a very different time to be picking players than drafting now. And so, Benny, I want to have you start on this, since this was kind of the point you brought up.
Yeah, so before this turns into a rant, I'll make it quick. So earlier in the summer, I really lean into safety in the early rounds, and then my later round picks, I'm trying to pick out the players that are like one training camp report away or one trade news away from really climbing up ADP. So, and also earlier in the summer, I'm more likely to take rookies because that's typically the cheapest they're going to be, especially your mid-round darlings. Better to get them free than in the 150s before they put up a 0 for half the season. And it's really about tracking early ADP with that, because so many teams are going to have that player at that late of a round, and half the time your lineup's not going to be able to compete with that. So, for example, Alexander Madison, he's a consensus 4th, 5th round pick now. In the first drafts I was doing, he was going in the 120s, and that's where I should have targeted him. I didn't really do it, but it was all dependent on that trade news. And I think he rose about 3 or 4 different times because of that trade news, which is weird to me. And honestly, as the sample size grows and we get later in the summer, that's where I tend to rely a little bit more on ADP, make sure I'm not reaching, and try to take some value that people wouldn't otherwise get.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Matt, you got anything to add to this?
Yeah, there's just more variability early on in the year, right? There's more. I mean, it's July right now, right? And even now, there's not a whole lot of certainty. We're kind of in that middle zone where, yeah, you can be a little more risky because we're not getting those training camps. We're not having those preseason spike games. We're not having, more certainty of who's going to actually be playing where. Like, for example, the Buccaneers QB situation. We have no idea who that's going to be, right? We think it's going to be Baker. Maybe it's Kyle Trask. We don't know. If you are all in on the Buccaneers for whatever reason, you can probably get all those players for cheaper than you will once we have some certainty and we know what's going on there, as well as free agent signings. Like, if you want Dalvin Cook right now, or maybe DeAndre Hopkins is the less problematic example of that, you could get DeAndre Hopkins for way cheaper earlier on when we didn't know where he was going to go, versus now there's a sort of a known estimation for him there in that Titans offense. So just be more wary of that during your drafts. As you said, Benny, towards the end of August, the ADP is going to be there for a reason, because they're pulling from all these things. So the ADP is a little more solidified with sort of more people's expectations, versus right now, earnestly, it's kind of a free for all. So take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And with tournaments, either in DFS and best ball, like, volatility is your friend, right? You want to lean into volatility because the range of outcomes is what allows there to be this big upside and allows you to gain advantage by leaning into that volatility. Obviously, you can lean too far into it, right? We're not saying like reach 5 rounds on a player that might end up being way higher in ADP in the future. No, like, still follow ADP particularly early, and then eventually take your stances on Alexander Madison. I think he's going to be the number 1 this year. DeAndre Hopkins, he's going to land in a good offense. Dalvin Cook, he's going to land in a good offense. Alvin Kamara, he's not going to get suspended. Like, whatever your stances are that you have, like, you can take those once you have a good foundation for your team, and that'll help you get your upside even higher. Guys, this has been a really fun podcast. That's going to be all for our show for this week. We hit a lot, and I feel really great about all the points that we brought up today. I feel inspired to go do some more drafts. And, I was going to do the Pomeranian too. I thought about it, but it's already full. Like, we had a whole week go by. Like, we did our show last week. Underdog released a new contest, and it's full this week. So, maybe that's why you don't enter the Pomeranian.
People love best ball. What can you say? It's a great format.
What can you say? And hey, if you're watching this show, you're getting all the best advice to take down those tournaments. Before you go, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And remember, you can find my Week 17 guide for stacking and correlating teams at clubfantasyffl.com. Reminder to send in questions. We'll get to them in future episodes. A quick rundown of everything going on at Club Fantasy. First off, our Dynasty podcast, Dynasty After Party, aired yesterday. It's available in your feed now. This morning, we had our weekly Mock It Like It's Hot show. We also have an episode of Her Story in the Making every 2 weeks on Tuesdays coming up. Tomorrow night, we'll have Kelly Singh and Adam Hollis bringing you Who's Your Caddy, our DFS golf show. Wednesday night is our flagship show, no pun intended. We are in the home stretch releasing articles covering all 32 teams. We are coming down to the wire. I frankly cannot remember even what team we had today, but I know we're in the bottom 5, and we're going to give you a big deep dive on one player, and then we'll give a short burst on every other fantasy relevant player. For Matt Record at mrecord21 and Benny Israel at Benny_bestball, this has been Summer School. I am Austin Amandolia at Austin_FFL. And until next time, remember, defense wins championships, offense wins fantasy football, and best ball wins money. We'll see you next time.
See you next week.